Who were the Magi? How many were there? We always think of 3 Magi because they brought 3 gifts. Makes sense. But in the ancient world, sometimes there are just 2 Magi listed. And once in a while, there's 12 Magi listed because they thought there'd be 12 Gentile tribes represented, just as there were 12 tribes of ancient Israel. We just know Magi is in the plural. But they were the scientists of their day. They were trying to figure out how the world worked and what their place in the universe was. So they would study especially the night sky, and they had a lot of textbooks to build on. They had records of the rising and setting of stars and constellations and the planets. And suddenly something appeared that did not fit in their textbooks. It was something new. It was something different. They had to think about it. And they had to share ideas. What could this mean? Now, the ancient scientists were a lot brighter than we give them credit for. After all, their mathematicians and architects built great pyramids, built the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. We could see all types of manifestations of their genius. They also had some of the ancient Greek scientists who actually determined the real size of the moon and the distance of the moon from the earth within a couple kilometers, and also the size and shape of the earth. They were thinkers and observers. So they were very advanced in so many areas. But they didn't see the natural world as separate from the supernatural world, as we tend to do. So they thought, what could this mean? It's a reflection of something that's happening somewhere on earth. And this light evidently appeared in the constellation Virgo, the Virgin, in a greater constellation that they had labeled as Judea. A young woman has given birth to a new king in Judea. Let's go and see what this cosmic event is all about. Now, this relationship between the natural and the supernatural is not altogether alien to modern scientists. Albert Einstein, arguably the greatest scientist of the 20th century, one who proved that atoms existed, who showed and demonstrated that light was made of particles called photons, the one who gave us the classic formula, energy equals the mass times the speed of light squared. When asked about his life's work, he said, well, what's your life work all about? He said, I'm trying to figure out the mind of God. And that's exactly what the Magi were trying to figure out. That's what they were trying to figure out. And so they go to Jerusalem, the capital, and they go to the king. This was a huge mistake. They were scientists and scholars, but they weren't up on politics. Herod was notoriously paranoid. He killed several of his own children who wanted to be king. He was really intensely enamored with his own power. He was called Herod the Great because he was on some great building projects. He built the whole seaport, Caesarea, to honor Caesar. He was building the greatest temple to God ever built in Jerusalem, although he wouldn't live to see its completion. It would take decades to complete it. But he really was such a violent man that Caesar Augustus said, you know, you have a better chance of surviving if you're one of Herod's pigs than if you're one of his children. So they go to him and say, hey, there's a newborn king. This was not a good idea. And so then the theologians are brought in. Herod doesn't know anything really about the Messiah. He was half Jewish, half Gentile. So he brings in all the priests, all the scribes, and just where is this Christ to be born? He brings in the theologians and said, well, Bethlehem's the place. So he very slyly says to the Magi, you go find the child, and I'll come and worship him. Yeah, sure. So they go and they appear at the home where Joseph and Mary are living, not at the stable where Jesus was born, but now they're living in a house. And they bring him the gifts, noble gifts. Mary and Joseph had to be astonished. Here were Gentiles coming to honor their child. And that light that they followed would become the light of all the nations of the world, what Isaiah was talking about in the same first reading. And they too, although they were rational men, and they were great scientists, they also believed in dreams. Now they could distinguish a dream like caused by something that you ate the night before you went to bed, and prophetic dreams. All of them probably had the same dream: don't go back to Jerusalem. And so they skipped Jerusalem, and Herod realized he had been duped, and there would be the massacre of the innocents shortly after, where all the children, male children under the age of 2 would be killed. But Mary, Jesus, and Joseph would have already left the town and escaped to Egypt. A powerful story. But that light that they saw, leading them to Christ and to Mary and to Joseph, that same light has to be our guide in a darkened world. There will be other powers, say, go for fame, fortune, pleasure, but those all end up being like a dry well. The promises are not fulfilled for happiness and power. We're following the light of Christ that the Magi followed and made all the difference in their lives. Now, one of the things that Einstein discovered, he was taking a train ride out of Bern, Switzerland, and he looks out the back window and he sees a clock big in the city square. And the idea comes to him, what would it be like to be riding on a beam of light? And he said, as you approach the speed of light, time would stand still and finally come to a stop. And while people on the square would still see time passing, the light rider would be in an eternal situation. And if we ride the light of Christ, we'll get through this life passing our time well, but be prepared for a time when time itself will stop and will only be in the presence of the God of love. And there we'll meet all the Magi of the generations of the world, all the people who were wise enough to follow that star, who is the Christ, the light of the world.